it was, by any measure, a remarkable year. Student protests broke out throughout the West, in Europe, in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Italy, in the United States, in Latin America. What did they have in common? Well, the student movement is difficult to interpret in many ways, but maybe one important theme that they had in common was an attack on the promise of capitalism itself. The idea that material prosperity is enough. This had been the assumption of their parents' generation. In Europe, the people who had set about the difficult task of rebuilding Europe after the destruction had worked very hard to create a new economy, and they measured their success in terms of what they had accomplished in this domain. The fact that they now had refrigerators, the fact that they had cars, the fact that European society seemed to have made a new transition into a modern era. For the younger generation in the 1960s, however, this seemed like a kind of unimaginative or unsatisfying vision of a future. They looked around them and they saw a society that was still marked by injustice. They saw, students in Western Europe saw the presence of American troops in Germany, and they were aware that American troops were also being used in Vietnam. Sometimes this generational struggle could take on particular forms in different countries. German students in 1968 were incensed when they discovered the participation of their parents' generation in the crimes of Nazism. That many of the most respected figures in the German establishment and industry had continued to work during the Nazi period, and there was an argument here. Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of the independent West Germany, had somebody on his staff who had helped pen the Nuremberg laws in the 1930s, the laws which defined Jews as non-citizens under the Reich. In the United States, the student movement also took a particular flavor. There was a tremendous anger about the persistence of segregation in the United States, which seemed to undermine any claim that the United States could have to be a representative of liberal values, of democracy, of equality. It seemed to them to be a hypocritical system that needed to be rejected wholeheartedly. This movement developed on university campuses, and in some places, the goal of student protesters was to reach beyond the campuses and ally themselves with other groups in society who might help them make a real revolution. In Paris, in May 1968, it looked briefly for a moment that this might happen. But it didn't. What makes 1968 so striking is that there were not only these student protest movements in Western Europe and in the United States, but there was also a movement to confront the Soviet Union and its power over Eastern Europe. And in particular, the emergence of Alexander Dubček in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, who attempted to articulate a new vision of a kind of independent socialist society in the East. He called it socialism with a human face. And in some sense, this was the very kinds of reforms that Gorbachev entertained later, to experiment with a new form of openness, to not stifle dissent. Unfortunately, for Alexander Dubček and his followers in Czechoslovakia, the Soviets themselves had none of this, and within the space of several months, the troops had invaded, and this opportunity for opening a new opening in the East was lost. So why is it the turning point that didn't turn? Well, the revolution didn't happen either in the East or the West. There wasn't a new form of socialism in the East that looked different from the version that was being propagated in the Soviet Union. And the movement to create some kind of new society that would reject the consumerism of the West also trickled out. And then I suppose the greatest indication of this is that the posture of rebelliousness itself becomes a commodity in the 1970s and the 1980s. Rock and roll culture, even somebody like Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, he capitalizes on this image of the rebel, but it becomes part of the way that you sell records that later is, death metal bands in the 1980s are propagating some of the same postures of critique, but it's been incorporated into a consumer society. And of course, the real political result of 1968 was the conservative backlash, which was evident in France, in Britain, the emergence of Margaret Thatcher by 1980, Ronald Reagan in the United States, who found a core constituency amongst their electorate, among voters who were horrified by what they saw as the disorder of these revolutionary goals propagated by the student movements in the 1960s.